Hello, this is Dr. Stephen Bujno. Welcome to Catholic Moral Theology at St. Joseph's College, Maine. This is U03, Lesson 6, Nuptial Mystery, Love and Family in light of the sexual revolution and cultural variations. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to try to address love into context in relation to marriage and human sexuality. So, when I teach this in the classroom, I always ask students, what would be an obstacle to presenting this as a standalone video? And they always reply, typically in the same way, that there's no opportunity to dialect, to go back and forth. So I can't recreate that in a video, but I could take the distillation of our efforts and try to place that into the video. So sort of the conclusions that we reached as we were batting things around. It's a little difficult to do into a 30 to 40 minute video. This obviously requires a lot more nuance and discussion. But nonetheless, here we go. And if at any time it appears disjointed, hopefully that doesn't take away from the content. Now, in the last lecture, I began with Gabriel Marcel's distinction between problem and mystery. So just to reiterate real briefly how it applies to this particular topic. A problem is something that's in front of us, and it has all the elements which can be systematically addressed. So you could have a plan or a protocol that can be applied to determine and then arrive at some solution to the problem. So a mystery then, by contrast, is something that we ourselves are involved with and embedded in that mystery as human persons. So the mystery unfolds and it requires involvement. It's not solvable in the same way that a problem is. And, to think otherwise then, and this is the issue, conflating the two, when you treat a mystery like a problem, it derails any hope of reconciliation, mutual understanding, or a common respect that we'd have for each other. And of the many issues that besiege us about these truths concerning marriage and human sexuality, they're not problems to be solved. So we shouldn't look as though, whatever it is we're talking about in terms of marriage and human sexuality, well, what's the problem going on here and how do we solve it? That's not a good approach. It's also true that this may not be exactly the same type of mystery as a sacrament would. We accept that. But like sacraments, them both being mysteries, the issues that run counter, whatever it is that we're talking about, to an authentic understanding of marriage and a genuine expression of human sexuality, they involve persons. And there we are in a deep-seated mystery in the truest and fullest sense. In John Paul II, if you recall in his view of the personalistic norm, it reminded us that the only authentic and dignified response to a person is indeed love. Now, how is that love understood? We should at least realize that love has to be connected to a truth. If you do not have love connected to a truth, then all you are left with is subjective sentiment. I'll repeat that. If love is not connected to a truth, then all one is left with is subjective sentiment. So in one way, we can say that the idea of love, when left vague and unclear, like perhaps saying like all we need is love, it sounds right, there's a ring of truth to it. What it becomes, at least how it's understood, is nothing more than acceptance. And this is alluring because that acceptance has the connotation of being kind and considerate. And it may be followed up with, well, shouldn't all Christians be welcoming? But again, that sounds like somebody's expressing love, but they are simply expressing what we'd say just call acceptance. And all parents and teachers, priests, counselors, we're all aware that if you accept what somebody is doing, their action or their ideas, disconnected from truth, it's going to lead to disharmony in the heart and the mind. That's one side of the approach. The other side is if somebody says, well, love's connection to truth simply needs to be stated straightforward, with some authoritative or dogmatic conviction. You may hear this phrased in, well, we need to simply tell them the truth and then let the Spirit work in them. But here again, parents, teachers, priests, counselors, and such, we're all well aware that if you attribute an authority disconnected from love, it'll also lead to disharmony in the heart and in the mind of a person. It just comes across as overbearing. So the former approach, the idea of acceptance, that's thought to be lax and laden with error. And the latter, the dogmatic approach, is more rigorous, but true, we would think. Sometimes these terms, liberal and conservative, are used to explain these dichotomies, but those are political terms, and they're not really useful in dialogue. You could refer to the former as heterodox, expressing wrong belief, and the other as orthodox, expressing true belief. But that level of thinking is where the danger lies, I think, because these two approaches to the issues of marriage and human sexuality are really false binary choices. So how do we traverse this tension between being considerate on one hand and welcoming, while retaining conviction and remaining dogmatic? In other words, how do we profess the truth without the other feeling alienated by our manner and our approach, or contrarily making the other feel welcomed by simply casting aside the truth so that we appear accepting? Well, in a word, love, but we're going to have to spend more time understanding what this is, so everything must be filtered through love. Now, Christian love is simply not saying what is good for the other person, so love cannot simply be telling the truth or saying what the other person wants to hear, so love cannot simply be accepting their truth. That's the false dichotomy, and it dissolves with the proper understanding of authentic love. If we understand love as willing the good for the other person, the good Thomistic definition, then what does that mean in terms of reaching out to others in the spirit of Christian evangelization, in terms of the many issues that we deal with in our culture, in marriage and human sexuality? Well, here's a way that I think we can reduce the tension, and my suggestion. It begins by entering into relation with those persons in our lives. In other words, don't speak to somebody if you don't love them. I think that's worth remembering. It also means to be willing to enter into dialogue. That takes time, and it takes effort, because relationships have to develop. Now, we cannot hold the expectation that the other must submit to the truth that we offer, because, in fact, there's no need for an immediate response on their part. Life is not a game show. We don't have to have those gotcha moments. We don't need them to concede. Not in front of us. There's no notches on the Bible when it comes to this. So in this way, love means don't try to win the argument, but try to capture their hearts. It means understanding that the brokenness, and this is the important part, that we are addressing in them is as much present in ourselves, even if it manifests itself differently as it does in others. So we need to remember that parents, nurture their children in truth. Just saying it or imposing it, that's not loving, and it's certainly not effective, and it's not welcoming. So how this means, or what this means then, is recognizing that the mystery we find ourselves involved with are persons. And this is the new evangelization. Most people do not simply need to hear what the church teaches. They've heard it a long time, and they've heard it before. But they need to hear and know that the church loves them. Now, here's where we have to be very clear that we are the church. So it's not something else loving them, it's us loving them. Now, this is not an easy task in our time, but love isn't easy. Remember what Paul proclaimed to the Corinthians. Scripture says, love is patient and kind, love is not jealous or boastful. It's not arrogant or rude. Love does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrong. It rejoices in right. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. So, if we take that to heart, how might embracing that attitude of love be brought to bear on our witness on the issues surrounding marriage and human sexuality in our culture? That's our challenge. So, we're one body of Christ. And again, as Paul said, if one member suffers, then all suffer together. So, we need to learn how to witness love to those who we are suffering with. That's the mystery, right? We need to learn how to witness love to those who we are suffering with. Now, I think that's an important preface, but now we can move on to the content. To discuss the cultural climate of the United States as a development contributing to the sexual revolution, that's a course in itself. But I do think some general remarks can be made to place our present cultural climate, attitudes of human sexuality into historical context. We often accept underpinnings of our own culture as some natural, organic unfolding of events. In other words, well, this is just how it is. For some, perhaps more so when we were younger, cultural conditions that are inherited are just simply accepted uncritically. For example, let's think about dating. For anybody who was probably born in at least the 1950s on, We understand that dating is falling romantically in love with somebody and then arranging dates and going out on dates by yourself. But that type of cultural expression of courtship did not really appear until the ubiquitous spread of automobiles. As odd as that might sound, there was no destination to go to, nor any way to get to that destination just as couples. If anybody watched the movie The Godfather, when Michael Corleone was in Sicily and he met Apollonia and betrothed himself to her, they were going out for a walk on this lane, apparently by themselves, but as the camera panned back, you saw all the women of the village, at least of the family, behind them. So there was never that same type of dating that we accept now. So young people, and even us when we were younger, we figured this is how it has always been. But if we understand that this is sort of the water that we swim in, so we never really know that the water is cloudy until we can get outside and study this from the outside and then realize, wow, there are different clarities of water depending on our positions that we take. So this compels us to ask then, how did the water get cloudy like this? In other words, we would just simply say, how did things get to how they are? That's what I want to briefly address here. So I'm going to start by talking about Thomas Malthus. So in 1798, Malthus published an essay entitled An Essay on the Principle of Population. Now, he was an English cleric and also the founder of the science of demography. He was also a biologist and economist. But nonetheless, his predictions were that the world's population would never be able to sustain itself at the rate that it was growing. So the fear of overpopulation was present here in the early 19th century. So food levels would not keep up with the supply side, and there would be mass starvation. And he thought those who did survive would probably only live at subsistence levels. Now, he proposed two moral ways to curb the population growth, ones that we would accept today. One could simply, delay marriage. So just marry when you're older. So, the later one marries, the fewer childbearing years the female has, thus the fewer number of children. And this would be one way to stem population growth. The other is simply to show some sexual restraint in your marriage. So couples do not need to be a slave to their instincts. You notice how he separates the instinct from the rationality and elevates the human person. Nonetheless, this would also produce fewer children. So one other way to slow down the population growth. Now, this did include some element of selective breeding. Malthus says, it does not, however, by any means seem impossible that by an intention to breed, there can be a certain degree of improvement, similar to that amongst animals that might take place among men. Whether the intellect could be communicated, genetically. Of course, they weren't talking in those terms, may be a matter of doubt. But he did say, size, strength, beauty, complexion, and perhaps even longevity. They are in some degree transmissible. So let's be clear that selective breeding did not exactly follow a eugenic goal. I mean, people do want healthy children. But my point here is that this dire prediction of overpopulation and starvation, it was simply in the air. So it was something that was in the back of their minds of the 19th and early 20th century. It might be akin to how in the 21st century we have terrorism in the back of our minds, in the background. It may not be a threat that we constantly think about, but it's there. If you grew up in the 60s, 70s, and even 80s, was the idea of nuclear war and Russia. So anyway, the insights gleaned from Darwinian evolution and these two elements of curbing the population and selective breeding, they all collide. And this eventually becomes, and I'm not attributing all of this to Malthus, but this becomes what is known as eugenics. So eugenics is that idea of improving the human race by controlled breeding, because what you want to do is increase desirable traits. Now, they say it was founded on junk science, the so-called science, but I want to be very clear that it was founded on very precise science. It was science nefariously utilized. So they were trying to get rid of the undesirable traits. Now, the people who have undesirable traits are always going to be at the mercy of the people with power, right? Because the people with power, they always want their particular traits to be preserved. So who were the undesirables? They were what they considered feeble-minded. But this feeble-mindedness, it'd be anachronistic to simply think we're talking about people with some clinical mental illness, as we would today. It included people with physical abnormalities. So the feeble-minded would be the blind, the deaf, and other similar handicaps, plus those with a variety of mental illnesses, which could include schizophrenia, which it's impossible to say exactly what they meant by that then, but it could be depression or anxiety, and even persons who fell on the spectrum of autism. But it was also inclusive, which would seem odd to our modern ears, people who were prone to masturbation, those who engaged in premarital sex, and then from that, women, unfortunately, who had out-of-wedlock pregnancies. Now, the reason why that group was included is because they were thought to not be properly using their reason. Again, it's an interesting way they saw that. So, in other words, they were unable to govern their impulses and behavior, so therefore considered feeble-minded. Now, this occurred in the United States, and often people are surprised by that history. There was a Yale study back in 2000 in the Annals of Internal Medicine, and it affirmed that eugenics movements in the United States, it was held in esteem during the pre-Nazi Germany years. So the laws that formed in Germany were actually patterned after what was in the United States. You can go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and I'm one of those people that read every plaque, so you may not like that, me when I do that. But there's one of the plaques that, it actually recognizes this fact. The eugenics between the U.S. and Germany, they were distinct, but nonetheless the parallels exist. So despite modern assumptions that, American interest in eugenics, waned from the 1920s, interestingly enough, researchers said sterilization laws had authorized the neutering of more than 40,000 people who were classed as insane or feeble-minded in 30 different states. This is up to 1944, so we're into the war years. And another 22,000 underwent sterilization from the mid-1940s up to 1963, despite weakening public support and even the revelations of the Nazi atrocities. So common to all of this in this movement, both the German and American eugenics, was that advocates believed science could solve social problems. So we're not in that type of eugenics, but we are in that concept that somehow an empirical approach to our social problems might help us. We'll talk more about that in another lecture. Now, it's important to understand is that in either case, they tended to measure the worth of the individual in economic terms, and they felt mental illness was a threat to society grave enough to warrant compulsive sterilization. North Carolina, it had the worst eugenic laws in the United States, and that continued well after World War II, even to girls as young as 10. Actually, there was a lawsuit brought up around 2011 to seek compensation for those who had been forcibly sterilized, people that were still alive. In 2013, they were judiciously awarded $10 million. Now, I want to introduce, moving on from Malthus, a couple of remarks about the Lambeth Conference. And this is concerning contraceptives, not birth control per se, as, all contraceptives are birth control, but not all birth control is contraceptive. So it's almost like saying all grass is green, but not all things that are green are grass, right? So the Catholic Church supports birth control. I'll explain that later. Up until 1930, every Christian faith expression, without exception, considered contraception immoral. And you can do your research on that. I don't know that you'll find anything, well, I'd be curious if you could imagine to find anything contrary to that. Even the Comstock laws attest to that. I'll let you look those up. The Lambeth Conference, this is the meeting of the Anglican Communion roughly every decade or so. In 1920 when they met, in Resolution 68, this is literally what it says, and I'll read. With grave concern, the spread in modern society of theories and practices hostile to the family, we utter an emphatic warning against the use of unnatural means for the avoidance of conception. Now, that's right in line with every other Christian denomination, and certainly the Catholic Church. But in 1930, 10 years later, in Resolution 15, a different cultural climate starts to come around, and they affirm now, and I'm quoting, primary and obvious method is complete abstinence from intercourse. But when they're talking about people who want to control births, they add, other methods may be used, though they strongly condemn any methods of control from motives of selfishness, luxury, or mere convenience. Now, that remark is the first historical moment when any Christian denomination or sect officially approved the use of contraception, even if it's limited, how they put it, and for very serious reasons within marriage. And from that time on, everything fell in line. But what's curious is that there was no theological argument, no biblical argument. They simply changed position. without any sort of way to justify why they did it. Okay. Next, Margaret Sanger. She's the founder of Planned Parenthood. So in 1917, she opened the first birth control clinic in Brooklyn. She founded the Birth Control League, and in 1942, the name was changed to Planned Parenthood. Now, there's a link between birth control and eugenics, and this is articulated by Sanger in the Birth Control Review. So the Birth Control Review is something that's available online, and it's like a 3-column newspaper. All I did here was I took a screenshot of one of the columns and placed it underneath the header. But this is just simply a screenshot of the Birth Control Review as it shows there in November of 1921. So she states here, eugenics must be dismissed as both vague and Victorian in spirit if it fails to recognize the central and fundamental importance of birth control. The melting pot is a failure as both superior and inferior racial stock are mingling, where families of better stock must procreate more to save the race from deterioration. Now, to be clear, that does not connect present-day use of contraceptives with some ulterior eugenic motive. That's not the point I'm trying to make here. But it does speak to one of the motivations for contraceptive use in the first half of the 20th century. And though I realize I'm connecting dots here over decades without an in-depth analysis, my goal is only to provide you some underpinning, that made the water cloudy. How did it get here? Nonetheless, as the development of the pill, which she fully supported and encouraged by Margaret Sanger, Dr. Pincus is credited with the invention of the birth control pill in 1960. It was released a few years earlier in 1957, but that was only for excessive menstruation. Now, this was a game changer. It was a very widespread way that separated the procreative element from the unitive element. So, first, exactly how does the pill work? The reality is, well, I guess I could say it this way. It has 3 general ways of suppressing, how we would say, procreation. Suppress ovulation, and this, by the way, is the primary intended effect. So in other words, it doesn't allow the release of the egg. So hormones are used, maybe not the best term, to fool the pituitary gland so that the woman appears pregnant as far as, the hormones being given artificially. So that then suppresses ovulation. So if there's no ovulation, obviously there could be no fertilization. Another way that it affects is it thickens the cervical mucus in the woman, and this makes it simply more difficult for the sperm to continue through the cervix and then, of course, up to the fallopian tubes. Now, those are the majority of the ways of how hormonal contraception works. But a third way is that if there is what's known as breakthrough ovulation, so an ovum still is released and the sperm does make it through the mucus and up into the fallopian tube, and there is fertilization. Now the fertilized egg, as it travels down the fallopian tube, the endometrium wall would become hostile to implantation. So this prevents implantation of the embryo into the uterine wall. Now, this is accomplished because the lining of the endometrium is thinned, and it depletes it of glycogen and a blood supply. Now, it's important to know that when there is this breakthrough ovulation and the woman released an egg in spite of the intended suppression, and once released is fertilized by the sperm, we consider this to be a human person at this point. And I won't get into arguing that right now, but nonetheless, it does not implant in the uterine wall. It's really impossible to know for sure how often this occurs, but this can occur between 2 and 4% of the time. This then would be a spontaneous abortion, and the fertilized embryo would simply be discharged with menses. But nonetheless, if a person is on contraception, knowing this can happen and having sex during the fertile periods, it still could allow the individuals to be culpable in what the event that unfolds. But there's a distinction here between the Catholic definition of abortion, which is any destruction of the fertilized human embryo or further, and the American Medical Association's definition. The American Medical Association defines pregnancy as an implantation, which is about 7 days after fertilization or so. Now, we, again, not trying to overconnect the dots, but if you remember Plan B, aka emergency abortifin drug, or emergency contraception, I should say, um, would actually cause a spontaneous abortion if there has been breakthrough ovulation. So because that became somewhat of a concern, you and in back in the day, back on the back box of Plan B as far as side effect, abortifacient was there. But once the definition of pregnancy, I'm sorry, the definition was moved not from was fertilization moved to implantation, then by Plan B not allowing implantation, therefore, according to their definition, it was no longer an abortifacient. Nonetheless, we could spend a lot of time on this, and I didn't care to do that as much. There's still much to talk about here. I just want to offer Humanae Vitae's response here when they brought up about grave concerns in relation to contraception. Now, this was Pope Paul VI's response in 1968 to the release of the pill, and also the culture that promoted and accepted its use. Now, Humanae Vitae was not received well, nor is it received well. It wasn't received well then. It's not received well now. In fact, at the time, many came together to take out a full-page ad in the New York Times, publicly protesting the church's stance. People, to be blunt, did not find the argument in Humanae Vitae convincing, but neither do I. Now, that's an important concession to make, because this document was not an argument. It was a statement. Now, within the statement, there were some predictions, and they were as follows: that there would be moral decline and an increase in fidelity. So, increase in divorce, infidelity, abortion, out of wedlock pregnancies, and other disorders. 2, loss of respect for women. So the woman's physical and psychological equilibrium would no longer be maintained. So that pill would permit the woman to become the object of the man's pleasure against her genuine goods. And there would be abuse of power. So countries would or could use forced abortions and sterilizations to control populations in order just simply to retain control. So this notion then, fourthly, of unlimited domain over our body. Now, there will be a mindset that accepts from this euthanasia, and following this in vitro fertilization, 3 biological parents and such, things that, were not known then, but nonetheless flow from that. Now, we have to be careful to not overstate the argument. This is not all because of the pill. We know that no-fault divorce, that was also an issue. We also know that let's say there's a legitimate question to ask about the negative effects from separating the responsibility from the sexual act. As a matter of fact, let me word it that way. Rather than treat this dogmatically, that is the one thing that contraception has done that I think we can make an argument via natural law in the public sphere, is that once you separate responsibility from the conjugal act, then all we are going to wind up with is people seeking pleasure for each other. I'll have to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But anyway, quoting Humanae Vitae, it's not the tool to enter into dialogue. It doesn't even really work with most people who consider themselves devout Catholics, even though Humanae Vitae is meant for the faithful, and it does affirm truth. If you think of a young unmarried person who's engaged in premarital sex, do you think they really just simply need to be told that fornication is a sin? I mean, there is no Christian denomination that I'm aware of that does not say that sex before marriage is not a sin. So to simply pointing out that from sacred scripture convince them? It will not, right? So in the same way, we find ourselves all, in sin, and oftentimes in full knowledge. That's why sin is culpable. They already know as unmarried individuals. But the truth of this hasn't reached their heart, as most things have not reached ours. So we have to suffer with them, part of this, right? So a better approach is to ask if they really think giving themselves to another sexually with no commitment can preserve their dignity. In other words, asking them, does having sexual relations with somebody who has not said I do you think that has zero effect on your heart? In other words, do you think you were so isolated from your body that somebody can use your body for pleasure and has no effect on your heart? They know the answer to that one. And that's not a half-bad way to begin dialogue, rather than going through the Humanae Vitae angle. I'm not a big fan of arguing for all the side effects of hormonal contraception, as prevalent as they are, because you have to realize that if you enter into that discussion, somebody will clearly say that all treatments have side effects. And then we're going to be arguing over weighing those side effects as proportionate to the goals that they want. So we're going to be arguing about the benefits of the hormonal contraceptive over the side effects. And to be quite frank, if you're talking about copper IUDs, the side effects are so minimal, I'm not sure how that argument's going to suffice. But if we keep the argument to separating responsibility from the sexual act, that covers it regardless. So it's always best to stick with the theology, but placing it into a good argument. Now, one last side note, because some women do take the pill for other reasons, and they are totally legitimate, to lessen menstrual bleeding, cramping, irregular periods, stabilizing mood changes, contributing to depression, treatment of ovarian cysts, iron deficiency like anemia, or even severe acne. Humanae Vitae addresses that. It says, on the other hand, the Church does not consider at all illicit the use of those therapeutic means necessary to cure bodily diseases, even if its foreseeable impediment to procreation should result therefrom, provided such impediment is not directly intended for any motive whatsoever. So these aren't exceptions. It's the fact is that, yes, you would still go to your OBGYN for those, and they would still call it the pill, but you're not using it for contraception. You're using it for an entirely different moral object. The OBGYN might say, here's birth control, but you're taking it to be treated for a pathology. It just simply is the same pharmaceutical. The principle of double effect applies here. The caveat is that if a woman is, let's say, has ovarian cysts and is on hormonal contraception to treat that, you still have to abstain of sexual relations during the fertile period, because the breakthrough ovulation is still possible, and thus a spontaneous abortion. So, what then is this birth control that the Catholic faith supports? If we just leave contraception as the concept of inhibiting the fertilization that comes through the conjugal act, without me, going exclusively over the method effects, I'd much rather talk, to make this shorter than it could be, or maybe should be, the idea of natural family planning, which not all OBGYNs are familiar with, and most young people have no clue what it is. Nonetheless, what NFP does is it works within the natural system of the woman's body. It looks for and identifies women's signs of fertility. So to love each other conjugally during a period of fertility, if you desire a child, then you would have conjugal love during that fertility window, and if you did not, for serious reasons, want a child, you would then avoid conjugal relations during that time. So what are some of the signs? And I'm not going to go through the various different methods here, but overall, the female would observe cervical mucus, basal body temperature, change in the shape or texture of the cervix itself, breast tenderness, abdominal pain, and such. So here's the idea. Couples learn to observe and interpret the signs that they chart. Now, for a female, fertility is always internal. For a male, it's always external. So with contraception, the male doesn't really need to be part of the woman's fertility. The woman takes care of that, and she's on her own. Now, we're not talking prophylactics and stuff here. What natural family planning does, and I'm convinced that if this did not have, sorry to say, Catholic cooties, most feminists would embrace this, because not only is it natural, which seems to be something we're gunning for these days, but it builds dignity within the woman. And here's how, is that it draws the man into the internal fertility of the woman. The man now knows the cycle, knows what's going on. Now, but when I say knows, what I mean is that they have entered into conversation. So they have simply not said, quite frankly, I feel in the mood, what do you, and then start, instigating sexual relations. The couple has sat down and said, what are we thinking about as far as our family? And the husband and wife could decide that right now, I'm starting a new job, we don't have insurance, we don't have the money, just go down the line, that we should not bring a child into the world. So charting the woman's fertility window, which, quite frankly, an ovum, an egg, is only viable for 1, maybe 2 days. Sperm could live in the vaginal cavity for maybe up to 7 days or so. So let's just say, and I'm really simplifying it here, a fertility window for a woman is roughly 8 to 9 days. Outside of that, it's physically impossible to get pregnant, because if there's no egg, you cannot get pregnant. You can chart this fertility window. If a couple were having fertility issues and went to an OBGYN, the first thing you would do is figure out where and when are you fertile. When are you fertile? So all natural family planning is doing is determining that up front. And then you see how this builds conversation, and because it builds conversation and relationship, it builds respect. And if the couple has decided to avoid the conjugal act during that fertility window, then that's some mutual bonding that for the woman is gold, because she knows that her husband is there holding her hand, giving her a back rub for nothing else than for her own good, with no ulterior motives, because we've already had a discussion about all of this. Nonetheless, why is this then different than contraception? That shared responsibility, right? It's 100% natural. This respects both the unitive and procreative dimensions. That's an important factor, especially when, in other words, the husband and the wife are preparing for parenthood. So there's all this dialogue that's, fostering responsibility, and it requires absolute cooperation. And during those periods of abstinence, it could be like almost a renewed courtship, because there's nothing there to include sexual contact. This also demonstrates our ability to rationally control our sexual impulses, right, and our desires. And natural family planning is free. So anyway, the reality is that this is another part of our culture that, doesn't have an authentic understanding of human freedom. And ironically, they block that mentality and humans' rationality by using means other than that. Okay, I realize this is a lot already, but this all has some real effects on human sexuality and marriage that I'm going to have to talk about now. Marriage in the Catholic faith is, by definition, the matrimonial covenant by which a man and woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole life, and it's ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring. It's been raised by Christ to the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament between the baptized. You can find that in Canon Law 1055, Section 1. Now, the reality is that it cannot just simply be a contract. Contracts are always determined by various factors. They involve negotiation, limits, and importantly, in respect to marriage, it can and will include terms that allow for its termination. But a covenant, by contrast, incorporates some of those contractual elements because they are important. But it's not simply just an agreement that has a binding oath attached to it. We should think of this in terms of a seal, that cannot be broken. Just think of a wax seal on an envelope. That's the covenant. So this is the language of love that God uses to bind himself to us as his people. It's irrevocable. So we as his people, the church, are bound to him by covenant. And even in the face of brokenness, right? This covenant, unlike contract, it always endures. The Old Testament is just replete with covenants. And the one thing that they always ended with was the people breaking the covenant with God. God was always the one alone that was faithful. It's never simply just so a covenant is not a real serious contract. It's something entirely different. And marriage is a covenant. Now, it's certain there's been development of the present understanding of marriage, and that is in the way that it was listed as a universal sacrament in the Fifth Council of Florence in the 15th century, and then incorporated into canon law at the Council of Trent in the 16th century. But there's little dispute that since the apostolic times, it was never simply understood as a human institution. It was always a means of grace for mutual sanctification, of the couple. What's more important is how we want to say of this evolving understanding of marriage in Christendom there has been some enduring features. So we could make the claim, I think quite legitimately, that it has always been between two individuals. It has always been between male and female. It has always been openness to each other. It always has been exclusive. It has been something that's permanent, and has been something that's consensual. And it's always contained some idea of love, even if it's not the type of romantic love that we may think so today. But what has happened in our present culture is all of that has been reduced down to love plus some sort of sexual expression. So, is not love the primary feature of marriage? We would think today, and it is a primary feature, but in contemporary secular culture, we have no other central feature to claim. So the idea that one marries whom one loves, this is not unlike dating in the sense that and this may sound, again, odd to our modern ears, it's a recent phenomenon, at least in terms of its primacy. So for instance, me personally, my grandparents in Italy were part of an arranged marriage. Did they love each other? Yes. But we could not simply draw parallel lines between how they loved each other and the modern romantic notion of falling in love and dating. So part of the issue of surrounding marriage today is that we seem unable to understand love, which we, quite frankly, as I said, we leave undefined, and then it becomes disconnected from the sexual expression. So what we do then is we make this type of love, the sole principle of marriage, which is in many ways, it's thought nothing more than an elevated friendship. So once that trifecta is in place, then any individual who wants to sexually express their love, they understand marriage as the single place for that to occur. So it's a little surprised that marriage, not only as a sacrament for us, but as a secular institution, it's under assault. The assault cannot be laid simply at the feet of homosexual persons who want to redefine marriage. I always push back on that. It's always, or only, in very recent years, the definition of marriage has been changed legally. But it's been many decades where the understanding marriage has, as a covenant, has eroded. So it was eroded as an understanding, therefore, as a covenant by heterosexuals. So this is why I say that we can't place the blame on same-sex couples. So I want to offer you the premises for an argument that perhaps you can use that presents this marriage question in its binary form. Like, will it endure as the church understands it, or will it eventually be dissolved into some type of mutual contract? If we consider all the viable legal alternatives that are actually expressions of sexual unions, we could come up with polygamy, right? So this is a union of 3 or more. This is not, without warrant. In some states, there are movements to recognize this. We can talk about polyamory. This is just having, multiple people. Serial monogamy. So, monogamy is once and only for life. Serial monogamy is I'm going to be with one person at a time. Consanguinity. This is about people of close, blood relations being married. So there are instances where individuals that are biologically connected, at least in a close way, who wish to marry each other, and they argue that what they do is based on both love and consensualness, and do not understand why it simply cannot be. There's also this understanding of pure contractual development. So why can't it just be whatever we say it is? Or polygamy, which means that some people, quite frankly, want to marry themselves. As odd as that sounds to us, it's certainly something that's been thrown out there. We can go on. The point here is that once marriage is reduced, and this is the point, once marriage is reduced down to a contract between individuals that voluntarily enter into it, if we're going to call that marriage, then it's impossible to decline one expression while expressing another, accepting another. There's no other way to say it. Now, I want to say this about a Russian journalist, Masha Gessen, quite intelligent. I read about anything that she writes. She's a Russian-American journalist, an LGBT advocate and an activist, and an atheist. And she makes the point that after gay marriage is achieved, ambivalence is the only future for marriage as an institution. Now, I'm not quoting her as an authority. I'm quoting her argument and saying that her argument is very sound. I want to be clear on that. Here's her story in a nutshell. I hope you can follow me. She said she's been married 3 times. She was first married to D in 1984. Now, he was a homosexual man. This was the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. So she is a lesbian and him is a homosexual. They entered a very pragmatic marriage simply to escape the AIDS scene. They got divorced in 2000. But in 2000, she adopted a boy. And in 2001, she gave birth physically to a girl that she planned to raise with her girlfriend, who she did marry in 2004. They split up in 2006. A couple years later, she met Daria, and in 2011 gave birth to the third child. So when she was asked about marriage, this is her quote. She says, "It is a terrible, formulaic contract. It enforces unrealistic expectations and obligation. It obliterates lived reality." She says, "Take our family, for example. Our kids have 5 living parents, me and Daria, my ex and 2 of their biological fathers, one of whom happens to be my brother. Her brother's semen was used to artificially inseminate her girlfriend. Now, Daria and I," she says, "have the primary responsibility for sheltering, feeding, clothing, and schooling them. My ex provides the teenagers with a sympathetic ear into which they can unload complaints about me and Daria, and the bio dad's role is like that of uncles. In the case of my brother, it is that of an uncle. So if we were going to put family obligations into a contract, I would rather see one that reflects all the relationships for the kid's sake." So her overarching point is that the institution of marriage should not exist. She states that it's simply a lie, that the institution of marriage will not change once same-sex couples are allowed to marry. She says that anything else is simply creating a fiction. She wants a legal system that is compatible with her family arrangements, and she knows that's not possible with the institution of marriage as it stands now. Now, the point is, once that you have reduced everything down to a contractual relationship based on consensuality, you're not going to be able to maintain the two by changing the male and the female or changing the openness, the exclusive. One goes, they all go. This is often referred to as a slippery slope. Now, I want to be clear, as somebody who teaches logic, that slippery slope is not an ipso facto fallacy. It is only a fallacy when there's a weakness in the causal connections between the two things. So if the criteria is mutual consent and legal age, then where is the fallacy? Because all we're saying is that once you're above a certain age and you're consenting, it is what you want. Those conditions always fit. So therefore, it is a slippery slope, but it's not a slippery slope fallacy. Now, marriages with underage individuals, like children marriages or unwilling adults, forced marriages, or anybody that expresses bestiality, which I never get into, those are all slippery slopes. And because what has changed is the underlying conditions of the age and mutual consent. So I'm offering you a response, and I realize it's a secular argument, and I'm not quoting the Bible here. But this is simply another way to argue for the sanctity of the marriage covenant, particularly with those who do not share the faith or even agree, perhaps don't even understand the argument. We have our work cut out for upholding marriage as a covenant. But a way to approach this is that if the church were to adopt one alternative of the marital expression by simply using the criteria of mutual love or desire, then in what way can that same basis not be used for polygamy, polyamory, non-exclusivity? There's no argument against that. I wish I had the opportunity to share more on this in a deeper fashion, but we'll have to leave it at that. Now, as we move into sex difference in gender, this is the last topic that I'll address. And again, with trepidation that I'm not going to be able to do it proper justice in our context. But the term sex is a biological classification. Now, I know that this is a little, controversial to say the least. But nonetheless, we are talking about male and female. Now, there are exceptions we'd call intersex cases. So the reality is, though, and this is, again, according to the World Health Organization, so sex as male and female is not assigned, nor is it constructed. And I'm not trying to oversimplify this, but humans are born with 46 chromosomes and 23 pairs, and the X and the Y chromosome determine a person's sex. So from here on out, we'll say that the primary distinctions, and this includes genetic distinctions, another secondary distinctions like stature, hair. I should explain that. Is that if the primary distinctions are going to be on this genetic level, there are secondary distinctions between male and female. Size, hair, shoulder, broadness, upper body strength, and such. But even those are somewhat based on the XX or XY chromosomes, or some variation of. Now, there are variations on the XX and the XY, but they are abnormalities. They are not separate sexes. So if somebody says sex is on a spectrum and then includes one of these, we're talking less than 2%. To give you a visual, that'd be like looking at a football field and saying 49 yards on one side is male, 49 yards on the other side is female, and then that 2 yards in the middle where we do have some variances, that's a distinction. Nobody would look at a graph like that covers 49 yards on each side with 2 yards in the middle and call that a spectrum. But what is it that we're talking about within that short variation? Well, the reality is that they include, not limited to, Turner syndrome, right? This is an abnormal growth patterns. They're short in stature, generally lack prominent female, secondary sexual characteristics, and unfortunately sterile. There's XXX females. These are women with 3X chromosomes. So they experience normal development of sexual traits, and they are fertile. There's Klinefelter syndrome. This could be 47XXY or a mosaic comparison. But abnormal developments of the testes, there's hypogonadism, infertility, unfortunately. There's also XYY males. I'm only saying these to offer you some examples. Now, the XYY males, they're usually taller than average and prone to acne because what they do is produce higher than average levels of testosterone. There's what we call intersex, which used to be called hermaphroditism, right, where this is a genetic condition in which it affects individuals that have both mature ovarian and testicular tissue. Now, save these abnormalities, and this is not any reference to those individuals as persons. Once sex becomes a reality that is determined genetically and biologically as male-female, it doesn't change through hormone therapy. That could feminize or masculinize the female or the male, nor even with cosmetic operations, which some may consider in the transgender issues. Now, when we talk about gender, and I am one of those that if I'm filling in a form and it says your gender, male or female, I cross it out and write sex if I could, because I'm a stickler for terms, and these are not Catholic terms. I should at least put that. But the gender refers, in a sense, to an identity, and I don't mean that entirely that it's constructed or of a social kind. But there is an aspect to it. There's a self-marker based on the terms masculine and feminine. Now, there are aspects of masculinity and femininity that tend to be constructed and self-assigned, right? How we express ourselves in gesture and dress. That's changed over the years. But this doesn't suggest that they are entirely constructs. For instance, hormones directly affect aspects of our expression, right? So gender, typically described in terms of masculine and femininity, it may vary across different cultures and over time, but not entirely separated from our genetic makeup. Even if we were to say there's a number of cultures that, where there's greater gender diversity exists, and sex and gender may not always be so neatly divided amongst what we call the binary lines, such as male and female, or homosexual and heterosexual. I'm not going to list them here. But to be clear, these variations, these gender variations, they're not uniform. In other words, I can talk about various, cultural instances where people point to this and to that, but there's only really a few, and they're over many centuries, and they don't necessarily express gender fluidity in the way that it's being expressed today. So what I'm trying to say as a bottom line is I think they're overreaching claims in terms of the gender dysphoric persons. There's also some genuine psychological and spiritual issues that we simply know imperfectly. So I'm content to say that we do not know everything we should know about this. But there's some things we have to watch two different positions. There are some things that we do know. Let's not pretend that we don't. And there are some things that we do not know. Let's not pretend that we do, right? So our love for people who may have any type of gender dysphoria, it's not dependent on being able to express the issue perfectly. So I'm going to leave it there, only because if we were in the classroom, we could have more back and forth about it. But I'm going to talk, quite frankly, about the homosexual person. Now, you notice I said homosexual person. Persons are mysteries. So we have to understand each other always in the beginning as part of respectful dialogue. So what I'm giving you right now comes from the USCCB's website, all right? But listen to how it's worded. It's not that bad. I'm sure they would be glad to hear me affirm that. There is a need of a special effort to help persons with a homosexual inclination understand church teaching. At the same time, it is important that church ministers listen to the experiences, the needs, and the hopes of the persons with a homosexual inclination, to whom and with they minister. So dialogue, they say, provides an exchange of information, but it also communicates a respect for the innate dignity of the other persons and a respect for their consciousness. The following concept that I'm going to offer you here is taken from Father Louis Camille's Catholic on Homosexuality, New Paths to Understanding. He talks about a distinction between the acceptance of one's own sexuality versus a subjective judgment. He says, and I'm quoting, "If the fundamental truth of who I am, this includes my sexuality, comes to me as gift is something given prior to my choice or action, then I need to accept it. If I accept it, then I am also, in accepting it, affirming my responsibility and stewardship for that gift. I'm not determining what to do with myself and my sexuality on the basis of my own subjective judgment, but on the basis of who I am and what my sexuality is." So even heterosexuals, this is where we have to be very clear on this. We have people who have opposite sex attraction, they too have to integrate their gifts. So the idea of difference and differences, they often always result in some negative response. Historically, and in our own day, and I'm quoting here again from, Camille, a considerable number of people have made the judgment that difference in others and the difference of others is an evil that deserves our negative response. Something else has to move on there. The difference, he says, or he's trying to relay, always breeds fear. And he points out that the one who is not like me then becomes my enemy. Now, that's my concern, is that there are aspects of this that we do understand and then aspects we do not understand. For both sides, and I don't like placing it in terms of sides, but both for same-sex attraction and for opposite-sex attraction, we cannot see each other as the enemy. There's no way, that has nothing and no place in an expression of love. Father John Zizlas, he makes the point where he talks about the conflation of difference. When we consider difference to be nothing more than division, he literally says it results in the death of the human as a subject. The reality is that we are presently living in a culture, and I'm going to finish up now. I realize this has been longer than I intended, but it's so much easier to talk about in a classroom when you have 2.5 hours to go back and forth. Nonetheless, in our present culture, there's many drastic changes, and we have a lot of shifting cultural paradigms. And unfortunately, fear tends to be the response of many. So this fallback position is a retreat to safety once we experience fear. And this applies to all sides of the issues. For the traditionalist view, there's this threat to marriage and long-held views on sexuality that are protected by considering the other as enemy. For the revisionist position, anybody who attempts to hold on to the traditional position, they appear to be the threat considered the enemy. So the reaction to this is not just recognizing the difference, that's important, but in order to accept it out of negatively avoiding the fear or positively accepting the behavior to dissolve the fear. Both of those are subjective reactions, and they really do not resolve anything. So what we need to speak about here directly is that too often in Catholic discussions, the issues of sexuality and gender, they always enter this nurture and nature debate. Someone born that way. Now, on the one hand, that's important. For one, the biology of sexuality is critical for moral theology. Theology, quite frankly, relies on the sciences for understanding. John Paul II said specifically, and this is a good quote, "Science can purify religion from error and superstition. But religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes." I'll repeat that. Science can purify religion from error and superstition, but religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. So in this way, science helps form approaches to addressing the issue pastorally. But the other issue is in terms of the judgment, the degree of culpability or guilt. It's always relative to the ability for one to have control over their actions. If somebody is unable to control their actions, they cannot be held to the same degree of culpability as those who can. So we need to be there in terms of love and care regardless, pastorally. We would ascribe a higher level of culpability, guilt, to the one who has the higher degree of freedom. It's certain that one's sexual orientation is not simply determined by a gay gene, but that doesn't mean there is not a genetic component to it. Outside of eye color and the like, there's precious little that are determined by a single gene. So how do we apply these unknown factors of genetic predispositions, intrauterine, gestational factors as flooding with estrogen, childhood development, the myriad of familial and social influences on children? How do we separate that from the issue of same-sex attraction and the gender issues? Our understanding of those issues, they have to, in some way, follow what we can glean from the empirical sciences. But remember, there is no conflict between the empirical sciences understood as reason and faith. Even St. Augustine stated that, when there's a conflict, and this is pretty profound, when there's a conflict between a proven truth about nature and a particular reading of Scripture, an alternative reading of Scripture must be sought. So don't interpret that as thinking that the Christian must believe whatever science deems as true. My point is that we don't know for certain the underlying causes of people's orientations. We also don't fully realize the extent of the issues of gender dysphoria. And on this, I want to be clear. A person is culpable to the degree that they can freely choose. So we're going to leave that judgment up to God. When Pope Francis said, "Who am I to judge?" he wasn't being indifferent. I think that's precisely what he meant. Now, I've been in enough of these discussions to recognize that at some point in the conversation, things do get uneasy. Those who simply wish the Church's doctrine on marriage and sexuality, they think any nuanced position is fence-sitting. Perhaps somebody thinks that of me. And they want the need to change to be directly stated. I should have been more dogmatic. The other spectrum thinks that this type of approach is entering murky water, and it's only going to cause confusion amongst the faithful, and thus a scandal. Well, I don't mind causing the confusion if it's going to lead us to understanding it more deeply and more nuanced. So do you see how these terms, liberal and conservative, they don't really appear to fit here? They only become obstacles to dialogue. So I'm going to conclude where I began. What does it mean to reach out to others in the spirit of Christian evangelization if we're speaking to somebody about these issues and we don't love them? Our willingness, really, quite frankly, to enter into dialogue, it takes time, and it takes effort, and it takes, the reality of developing a relationship. We cannot hold the expectation that we're the other who we're speaking with must submit to the truth that we're offering. Quite frankly, that is what the other side also thinks. They think that we need to submit to their truth. Nothing will ever come out of that. Love means not trying to win arguments, but to capture hearts. I said that. Remember, it means understanding that the brokenness that we are addressing is as much present in ourselves, again, even if it manifests differently, as it is in the other. It means recognizing the mystery that we find ourselves involved with are human persons, and they are finding that we ourselves are mysteries to them. So we do need to speak the truth boldly, but do not enter into discussion with somebody that you do not love. Remember Francis of Assisi's admonition? He says, where there is error, let us bring truth. Where there is discord, let us bring union. And it's better to understand others than it is to be understood ourselves. That is the basis of our new evangelization.